August 15, 1945. The war was over, but for 43 Japanese women stepping off a dusty military transport truck in the middle of nowhere, Texas, a different kind of battle was just beginning. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift prisoner of war camp outside Fort Stockton, turning the air thick and shimmering. Akiko Nakamura clutched her small notebook of pressed flowers tighter as her boots touched American soil for the first time. She had expected many things when she joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a nurse 3 years ago, but standing in enemy territory as a prisoner had never been among them. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, so unlike the mountains and rice fields of Kyoto. Everything here seemed oversized, overwhelming, and utterly foreign. Beside her, 22-year-old Michiko Sato whispered nervously in Japanese, asking if this was truly America, or perhaps some kind of purgatory. Akiko had no answer. She focused instead on maintaining her composure, standing straight despite exhaustion from weeks of transport through military channels that had brought them from the Philippines to California and finally here. The guards waiting for them were not what she expected either. Instead of the brutal soldiers she had been warned about through years of wartime propaganda, she saw men in uniforms who looked almost as uncertain as the prisoners felt. Several wore cowboy hats alongside their military caps, and their weathered faces spoke of lives spent outdoors rather than in barracks. One tall man with sandy hair and a gentle face stepped forward, removing his hat in what Akiko would later learn was a gesture of respect. Sergeant Robert Fletcher, though she did not yet know his name, surveyed the exhausted women with something that looked almost like concern. He spoke slowly to another guard, his voice carrying a soft drawl that made the English words sound almost musical. Whatever he said made the other man nod and begin organizing the prisoners into a line with surprising gentleness, guiding rather than shoving. Captain Helen Morrison emerged from the camp's administration building, her crisp uniform and stern expression commanding immediate attention. She addressed the prisoners in clear, measured English that Akiko, who had studied some English before the war, could partially understand. Something about rules, respect, and Geneva Convention protocols. The words meant little to women who had been taught that capture meant dishonor and that American captors would be cruel. Emiko Watanabe, a 35-year-old former teacher from Nagano, stood near the front of the group. Her face remained impassive, but Akiko noticed how her hands trembled slightly. Emiko had already begun assuming an unofficial leadership role during their journey, reminding the younger women to maintain dignity and remember who they were. Now she stood as a silent barrier between her countrywomen and these strange American cowboys who watched them with curiosity rather than hatred. As the guards led them toward the barracks that would become their temporary home, Akiko felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, but they held no malice she could detect, only questions. The barracks smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant, nothing like the cramped, humid quarters Akiko had known in the Philippines. 21 bunk beds lined each side of the long wooden structure, with actual mattresses and folded blankets stacked at the foot of each frame. Michiko touched one tentatively, as if expecting it to disappear. In the corner, a small pot-bellied stove promised warmth for cooler nights, though the current August heat made that seem impossible to imagine. Captain Morrison had assigned them 2 barracks, dividing the 43 women to allow some privacy and space. Through the window, Akiko watched the male guards retreat to their own quarters across the compound, maintaining a respectful distance that contradicted everything she had been taught about enemy soldiers. The setting sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her painfully of home, yet the landscape itself remained alien and unsettling. Emiko immediately began organizing the women, assigning bunks and establishing routines that would maintain their sense of order and identity. She spoke in rapid Japanese, her voice carrying the authority of a schoolteacher addressing uncertain students. They would wake at the same time each morning, maintain cleanliness, preserve their dignity, and above all, remain unified against their captors. Several women nodded agreement, but 19-year-old Hana Fujimoto looked toward the window with barely concealed curiosity about this strange new world. That evening, Corporal Danny Sullivan appeared at the barracks door, carrying a large pot of rice and vegetables. He set it down carefully on a table just inside the entrance, offering a shy smile and backing away without demanding anything in return. The food was simple but plentiful, seasoned differently than Japanese cooking but clearly prepared with some attempt at consideration. Akiko noticed small touches suggesting effort: soy sauce in a glass bottle, tea bags in a wooden box, chopsticks alongside forks and spoons. The women ate in silence, seated on their bunks or at the few tables provided. Each mouthful felt strange, accepting sustenance from those they had been trained to hate. Yet hunger was a practical matter, and Captain Morrison had made clear during her brief speech that they would be treated according to international law, fed adequately, and given medical care as needed. After the meal, Akiko retrieved her notebook and sat by the window as darkness fell over the camp. She had pressed flowers from Japan between these pages, small purple asters from her mother's garden, cherry blossoms from the tree outside her childhood home, delicate plum blossoms that had bloomed in the spring before she left. Each one represented a memory of a life that now seemed impossibly distant. She touched the dried petals gently, wondering if she would ever see such flowers again, or if this harsh, endless landscape would become her entire world. Outside, she could hear the guards talking quietly, their voices carrying across the still evening air, speaking of horses and cattle and tomorrow's work, as if having Japanese prisoners was merely another task on a long list of ranch duties. Morning arrived with a clarity that startled Akiko awake. No humid fog, no dense jungle sounds, just crystalline sunlight pouring through windows and the distant lowing of cattle. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through memories of the war, her captured unit, and the uncertain future that stretched before them all. Around her, other women stirred reluctantly, their faces showing the same exhaustion and displacement she felt. Emiko was already awake, fully dressed, her graying hair pulled back severely. She moved through the barracks like a general inspecting troops, ensuring everyone maintained proper appearance despite their circumstances. When young Hana appeared with her shirt untucked, Emiko corrected her immediately in sharp Japanese. They were prisoners, yes, but they would not become animals. They would remember their training, their culture, their pride. Breakfast arrived the same way dinner had, Corporal Sullivan leaving covered dishes at the door and retreating quickly. This morning brought rice porridge, toast, jam, and coffee, an odd combination of attempted accommodation and American staples. The women ate mechanically, speaking only in whispers when necessary. Emiko had made her position clear the night before. Silence was their armor. They would not fraternize, would not smile, would not give these Americans the satisfaction of seeing them broken or grateful. Captain Morrison appeared mid-morning with a translator, a Japanese-American soldier whose presence created visible tension among the prisoners. He was Nisei, American-born, and to some of the women, his choice to serve America marked him as a traitor. Morrison outlined the daily schedule through him: morning roll call, assigned work duties, meals at set times, 1 hour of outdoor exercise, lights out at 2200 hours. Medical needs would be addressed by Akiko and another nurse among them, with American medical supplies provided as necessary. The work assignments were surprisingly light: kitchen assistance, laundry, general camp maintenance, nothing resembling the hard labor they had feared. Morrison emphasized that Geneva Convention standards would be followed strictly. They were prisoners of war, entitled to humane treatment, adequate food, and basic dignity. Her words sounded sincere, but Emiko's expression remained skeptical, and her skepticism spread through the group like a protective shield. Sergeant Bo Fletcher stood quietly behind Captain Morrison during this briefing, his cowboy hat in his hands, watching the women with an expression Akiko could not quite interpret. It was not pity exactly, nor was it the cold assessment of a jailer, something softer, perhaps confused sympathy, as if he too was uncertain how to navigate this unprecedented situation. When the translator finished and Morrison dismissed them to begin their assigned duties, the women moved as a silent unit. They would comply with orders because they had no choice, but they would not engage, would not acknowledge kindness, would not allow themselves to see their captors as anything other than the enemy. Emiko had made certain of that, and most were too frightened and disoriented to consider any alternative path. 3 days passed in rigid routine. The prisoners moved through their duties like shadows, completing tasks without conversation or eye contact with the guards. Akiko had been assigned to assist with the camp's small medical station, organizing supplies and helping treat minor injuries among both prisoners and guards. The work gave her purpose, something familiar in this disorienting new world, though she performed it in complete silence. On the fourth morning, she noticed that several women were developing respiratory issues. The dramatic shift from tropical humidity to desert dryness was affecting their lungs. 2 younger prisoners ran low fevers, and Hana complained of a persistent cough that kept her awake at night. Akiko examined them with growing concern, knowing her limited medical supplies were inadequate for treating even minor illnesses properly. She mentioned this to Emiko, who immediately dismissed any idea of requesting help from the Americans. They would manage with what they had, as Japanese people always did. To ask for assistance would show weakness, would acknowledge dependence on their captors. Akiko reluctantly accepted this decision, though her medical training rebelled against allowing patients to suffer when treatment might be available. That afternoon, while organizing the medical station's meager inventory, Akiko heard boots on the wooden steps outside. She turned to find Sergeant Fletcher standing in the doorway, hat in hand, a large canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He did not enter, respecting the boundary she had maintained, but he set the bag down just inside the threshold and stepped back. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Thought you could use some of this, ma'am. Got it from the main supply depot." His drawl made the words soft, non-threatening. Before she could respond or refuse, he had turned and walked away, boots crunching on the gravel path back toward the guard quarters. Akiko stared at the bag for several long minutes, torn between Emiko's directive and her duty as a nurse. Finally, medical necessity won. She opened the bag and found it filled with supplies: cough syrup, antiseptic, bandages, aspirin, throat lozenges, even a stethoscope. Everything she had mentally cataloged as needed during her inventory. Someone had been paying attention, had noticed her concern, and had responded without being asked. She touched the bottles carefully, reading labels she only partially understood. The gesture confused her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she could process, could use to reinforce the clear lines between enemy and prisoner. But this quiet kindness, this attention to suffering, this violated everything she had been taught about Americans. It suggested that Sergeant Fletcher saw them not as defeated enemies to be guarded, but as people who deserved basic care. That evening, she used the new supplies to treat the sick women. She said nothing about where they came from, and no one asked. But as she listened to Hana's lungs clear slightly after the cough medicine, Akiko felt something shift inside her, small and uncomfortable, like the first crack in a carefully maintained wall. Corporal Danny Sullivan had grown up on a cattle ranch in Montana, learning to cook from his mother, who believed that food was the most honest form of communication. She had taught him that a well-prepared meal could say things words never could bridge gaps that language left wide open. Now, standing in the camp kitchen at dawn, he found himself thinking about those lessons more than ever. The Japanese women had been in camp for 2 weeks, and Danny had watched them grow thinner despite the adequate portions served at each meal. They ate mechanically, without pleasure or comfort, treating food as mere fuel. He understood why. Everything he prepared was foreign to them, his American staples as alien to their palates as their cuisine would be to his. But understanding did not ease his concern as he watched their energy fade and their faces grow more drawn. He began experimenting cautiously. He traded with other guards for ingredients, sent requests through Captain Morrison for items from the supply depot. Rice became a staple at every meal, rather than an occasional side dish. He learned to steam it properly, not the mushy texture he had grown up with, but the distinct, slightly sticky consistency he observed the women preferring. He acquired soy sauce and began using it to season vegetables, creating flavors that might seem more familiar. The breakthrough came when Hana appeared at the kitchen door one morning, sent by Emiko to collect the breakfast dishes. She moved to gather the plates quickly, keeping her eyes down as instructed, but Danny noticed her glance toward the stove where he was preparing lunch. He saw curiosity there, carefully hidden but unmistakable. Without speaking directly to her, respecting the distance the prisoners maintained, he began narrating his cooking process aloud, as if talking to himself. He described each ingredient, each technique, speaking slowly in case any of his words penetrated the language barrier. He sliced vegetables with deliberate care, arranged them aesthetically on the plate the way he had noticed. Japanese meals were often presented in photographs. The next morning, Hana returned for dishes and lingered slightly longer. By the third morning, she had begun pointing to ingredients and offering Japanese words, teaching him without quite acknowledging she was doing so. Daikon, she said softly, touching a radish, negi, indicating green onions. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, and she still would not meet his eyes directly, but communication had begun. Danny started incorporating these ingredients into meals, preparing dishes that blended American plenty with Japanese sensibility. He made rice balls filled with simple vegetables, prepared fish in ways that honored rather than smothered their delicate flavors, created soups that reminded the women of miso without being exact replicas. Each meal became a quiet conversation, his way of saying he saw them, understood their displacement, wanted to ease it however he could. Other guards noticed the changes and teased him good-naturedly about running a restaurant instead of a prison kitchen. But Captain Morrison observed the prisoners beginning to eat with slightly more appetite and said nothing, allowing Danny's culinary diplomacy to continue uninterrupted. September arrived with temperatures that seemed impossible to Akiko. The Texas heat was different from tropical humidity, a dry, relentless assault that left everyone exhausted by mid-afternoon. The prisoners had been issued lighter clothing, simple cotton dresses that replaced their tattered uniforms, but even these felt oppressive under the blazing sun. Work duties were shifted to early morning and late afternoon, with the hottest hours designated for rest in the relative coolness of the barracks. Danny stood in the camp kitchen on a particularly brutal afternoon, watching the thermometer climb past 100 degrees. He had grown up with Montana summers, but even he found this Texas heat challenging. His thoughts turned to childhood, to hot days when his mother would make cold treats to revive her family after long hours of ranch work. An idea began forming, risky perhaps, but worth attempting. The camp had recently received a small ice machine, a luxury that arrived with new equipment shipments. Danny had cream, milk, sugar, and vanilla extract. He also had fresh strawberries from a local farm that supplied the camp. Within an hour, he had prepared 24 milkshakes, thick and cold and sweet, topped with whipped cream he had painstakingly prepared. He loaded them onto a cart and wheeled it toward the prisoners' barracks, his heart pounding with nervousness. Private Red Martinez saw him and offered to help, understanding instinctively what Danny was attempting. Together they set up a small serving station in the shade between the two barracks, the tall glasses already beginning to sweat in the heat. When the women emerged for their afternoon roll call, they stopped, staring at this unexpected sight. Danny stood beside the cart, sweat running down his face, and spoke slowly. "Too hot today. Thought these might help. Cold, sweet, from my home." He gestured to the glasses, then stepped back, giving them space to decide. The women looked to Emiko, who stood rigid with disapproval. This was exactly the kind of fraternization she had warned against, but the heat was oppressive, and the drinks looked impossibly appealing, condensation running down the glasses in tempting rivulets. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Michiko stepped forward. Her naturally curious spirit, suppressed for weeks, finally overrode caution. She had been watching these cowboys, noticing their gentleness, questioning the propaganda she had absorbed. Now she reached for a glass, her hand trembling slightly. She brought it to her lips and took a small sip. Her eyes widened immediately. The cold was shocking, the sweetness unexpected, the creamy texture unlike anything she had experienced. A smile broke across her face before she could stop it, genuine and unguarded. That smile changed everything. Hana moved forward next, then another woman, then another. Within minutes, all 43 prisoners held milkshakes, tasting this strange American creation. Some laughed at the cold sensation, others closed their eyes in appreciation. Even Emiko, after a long hesitation, accepted a glass, though her expression remained carefully neutral. Danny watched them, his own smile growing. For the first time since their arrival, the prisoners looked almost happy, almost at ease, almost human rather than simply defeated enemies enduring captivity. The milkshake afternoon became legendary within the camp. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The prisoners still maintained their disciplined routines and formal distance, but something had softened. Occasional smiles appeared when guards passed by. Brief nods of acknowledgement replaced blank stares. The wall between captors and captives had not fallen, but the first significant cracks had appeared. Private Red Martinez had watched the transformation with particular interest. As a Mexican-American from New Mexico, he understood what it meant to exist between worlds, to be viewed with suspicion by some simply because of his heritage. He had faced questions about his loyalty when he enlisted, had proven himself repeatedly to men who saw his brown skin before they saw his uniform. Now, watching these Japanese women navigate their own impossible position, he felt unexpected kinship. He began appearing at the barracks during the evening exercise hour, bringing a small chalkboard he had requisitioned from camp supplies. Without making it mandatory or formal, he started writing simple English words and phrases, pointing to objects around the compound and saying their names clearly: table, chair, water, sky. The women watched from a distance at first, but curiosity gradually drew them closer. Hana was the first to actively participate, repeating words in her soft voice, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. Michiko joined next, her natural friendliness overcoming the last of her hesitation. Even some of the older women began listening, though they maintained greater physical distance. Red spoke slowly, used gestures, and most importantly, never made anyone feel foolish for trying. When Hana confused sheep with ship, he simply smiled and gently corrected her, explaining the difference without judgment. Akiko found herself drawn to these informal lessons, despite Emiko's obvious disapproval. Understanding English had become practical necessity. She needed to communicate about medical supplies, about prisoner health concerns, about basic daily needs, but she discovered something else in these lessons: genuine human connection. Red treated them with respect, spoke to them as equals despite their prisoner status, and seemed genuinely pleased when they made progress. One evening, after Red had taught them phrases for requesting items, Michiko surprised everyone by asking him to teach her how to say, "Thank you for the milkshake," in English. Red's face lit up. He wrote the phrase carefully, pronounced it several times, and waited patiently while she practiced. When she finally said it clearly, he responded with, "You're welcome," and explained what those words meant. The simple exchange carried weight far beyond its vocabulary lesson. Danny continued his kitchen experiments, now emboldened by the milkshake success. He prepared more diverse meals, asked Hana to teach him Japanese words for ingredients, and created fusion dishes that honored both cultures. The dining experience transformed from mere sustenance into something approaching pleasure. Women began eating with better appetite, their health visibly improving. Sergeant Bo Fletcher observed all this from his usual quiet distance. He had continued leaving medical supplies for Akiko when needed, never demanding acknowledgement, never forcing interaction. But he noticed how she had begun offering small nods when their paths crossed, tiny acknowledgments that suggested she recognized his quiet support. Late September brought mail delivery to the camp, a moment everyone had anticipated with mixed emotions. For the American guards, letters from home meant connection to families and sweethearts, reminders of the lives waiting for them beyond military service. For the Japanese prisoners, mail meant something far more complicated and painful. These letters had been delayed for months, traveling through military channels and censorship offices, carrying news from a world that no longer existed. Captain Morrison delivered the letters personally, her expression unusually somber. She had read the censored versions and knew what these women were about to learn. The translated summaries sat heavy in her hands as she entered the barracks where all 43 prisoners had gathered. The room fell silent immediately, every face turned toward her with desperate hope and barely concealed fear. Through the Nisei translator, Morrison explained that letters had arrived from Japan, from the International Red Cross, from various military processing centers. Some women had multiple letters, others had none, and Morrison watched their faces crumble as names were called, and theirs remained unspoken. Akiko received 2 letters, both from the Red Cross rather than family directly. Her hands shook as she accepted them. The translator helped those who needed assistance reading their correspondence. Slowly, the contents became clear, and grief filled the barracks like a physical presence. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by weapons unlike anything the world had known. Entire families had vanished in moments. Cities had been erased. The emperor himself had announced surrender, his divine voice broadcast across the nation for the first time in history, telling his people that the war was lost, and they must endure the unendurable. Michiko's letter informed her that her parents and younger sister had survived in Tokyo, but her brother had died in the Philippines during the final months of fighting. She read the words 3 times before they penetrated, then sat motionless on her bunk, the paper trembling in her hands. Hana learned that her entire neighborhood in Osaka had burned during air raids, her family's whereabouts unknown. She made no sound, but tears streamed steadily down her young face. Akiko's letters contained the worst possible news delivered in the Red Cross's bureaucratic language. Her family home in Kyoto had survived the bombing, but her mother had died from illness 2 months earlier, likely pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and stress. Her father's whereabouts remained unknown. Her younger brother had been killed in action somewhere in the Pacific, details unavailable. She read these facts with strange detachment, as if they described someone else's tragedy rather than the destruction of everything she had known. Emiko received no letters at all. She sat rigidly on her bunk, face expressionless, but her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The silence of no news felt worse somehow than terrible news confirmed. Not knowing meant endless, agonizing uncertainty, imagination filling the void with increasingly horrible possibilities. The American guards had anticipated some of this grief and maintained respectful distance. But as evening fell and the sounds of weeping filled the compound, several guards found they could not simply walk away. Bo Fletcher sat quietly on the barrack steps, not entering but present, his silence offering what comfort wordless presence could provide. October brought cooler temperatures and an unexpected proposition. The ranch surrounding the camp required extra hands for fall harvest, and Captain Morrison suggested that prisoners who wished to volunteer could work outside the compound under guard supervision. The work would be optional, physically demanding, and conducted in small groups. In return, the women would experience life beyond the fence and receive small compensations, books, writing materials, or other requested items within reason. Emiko immediately opposed the idea, viewing it as another attempt to break down their resistance and make them complicit in their own captivity. But many younger women saw opportunity in the offer. The barracks felt increasingly confining, especially after the devastating letters. The chance to be outdoors, to work with their hands, to focus on something other than grief, held powerful appeal. After intense discussion among the prisoners, 23 women volunteered, including Akiko, Michiko, and Hana. The first morning of harvest work began before dawn. Bo Fletcher and 3 other guards led the volunteers to a vast field where cattle grazed among scattered hay bales that needed collecting and stacking. The sky was immense, painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun rose. Akiko paused, struck by the beauty of this landscape she had initially found so alien. The endless horizon suggested possibilities rather than emptiness now, freedom rather than desolation. Bo demonstrated the work patiently, showing them how to lift bales properly to avoid injury, how to stack them for stability, where to position the loaded wagon. His movements were efficient and practiced, those of someone who had done this work since childhood. The women watched carefully, then began working in pairs, helping each other manage the heavy bales. The physical labor proved harder than anticipated. By mid-morning, everyone's muscles ached and sweat soaked through their clothing despite the cooler weather. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work, something honest and uncomplicated. They were accomplishing visible tasks, creating order from scattered chaos, contributing value through their efforts. For women who had felt powerless and purposeless for months, this simple, productive work carried unexpected dignity. During the lunch break, Bo's fellow guards shared their own meals with the prisoners, sitting in casual groups under cottonwood trees. Danny had packed extra food, knowing the physical work would generate serious appetite. Cowboys and prisoners ate together in the dappled shade, communication happening through gestures and shared exhaustion more than words. One guard showed Hana how to whistle through a blade of grass. Another taught Michiko to identify different cattle breeds by their markings. Akiko found herself working near Bo during the afternoon, stacking bales in a rhythm that required no discussion. At one point, she struggled with a particularly heavy bale, and he stepped forward to help without asking permission, their hands briefly touching on the rough twine. She met his eyes for perhaps the first time since arriving, seeing genuine kindness there, uncomplicated and freely offered. She nodded her thanks, and he smiled slightly before returning to his own work. The harvest work continued through October, and the volunteers grew stronger and more comfortable with both the labor and their guards. Conversations became more frequent. Laughter occasionally punctuated the workdays, and the distinction between prisoner and guard blurred in subtle ways. This shift did not go unnoticed in the surrounding community, and opinions varied sharply about Captain Morrison's progressive approach to prisoner management. In early November, Bo Fletcher approached Morrison with an unusual request. The nearby town of Pecos was hosting its annual rodeo, a smaller local event that celebrated ranching culture and provided entertainment during the slow season. Several guards had purchased tickets and wondered, tentatively, if some prisoners might be allowed to attend as guests under heavy supervision. Bo argued that the women had worked hard, maintained exemplary behavior, and deserved recognition beyond the confines of the camp. Morrison spent 3 days considering the request. The optics troubled her. Japanese prisoners, attending an American community celebration just months after the war's end, would generate controversy, possibly outrage. Local families had lost sons in the Pacific. Anger toward Japan remained raw and justified. Yet she also recognized that these women were not the architects of imperial aggression, and their transformation during captivity suggested that exposure to American culture served important purposes beyond simple punishment. She finally approved the outing with strict conditions. Only volunteers from the harvest work crew could attend, maximum 20 women. They would travel in covered military trucks, wear civilian clothes provided by the camp, and remain under constant guard supervision. At the first sign of trouble or hostility from locals, they would return immediately to camp. The women would sit together in a designated section, and guards maintain visible presence throughout the event. When Morrison announced the opportunity, reactions among prisoners divided sharply. Emiko refused outright and urged others to do the same, calling it a humiliating spectacle designed to showcase American superiority. But Michiko's curiosity won over her hesitation. She had heard guards describing rodeos with such enthusiasm, painting pictures of skilled horsemanship and authentic Western culture. Despite everything, she wanted to understand this country that had become her temporary home, wanted to see what made these cowboys who they were. 17 women ultimately volunteered, including Akiko and Hana. They dressed in simple skirts and blouses, clothing that felt strange after months in uniform or prison-issue dresses. Red Martinez reminded them to stay together, to avoid drawing attention, to remember they represented not just themselves, but challenged local perceptions about who deserved basic human dignity. The rodeo grounds buzzed with activity when they arrived. Families filled the wooden bleachers, children ran between booths selling food and trinkets, and the smell of grilled meat and hay filled the evening air. The prisoners' arrival caused immediate stir. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, and expressions ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Bo and the other guards formed a protective circle, guiding the women to their designated section while maintaining alert awareness of the crowd's mood. The opening ceremony began with the national anthem, and everyone stood. The Japanese women rose with the rest, uncertain and out of place, surrounded by people singing about a country that had defeated theirs. The rodeo exceeded all expectations despite the initial tension. Once the events began, the crowd's attention shifted from the unusual guests to the spectacular displays of skill and courage in the arena. Bronc riders stayed mounted on bucking horses that seemed determined to throw them skyward. Calf ropers demonstrated precision and speed that left the Japanese women breathless with admiration. Bull riding brought gasps from everyone, including guards who had seen it before but never lost their respect for the danger involved. Michiko watched everything with wide eyes, leaning forward in her seat, occasionally clutching Hana's arm during particularly dramatic moments. She had never imagined anything like this celebration of partnership between humans and animals, this testing of strength and skill without warfare or violence. The cowboys who competed showed respect for the animals even as they challenged them, a relationship she found fascinating and utterly foreign to her experience. During intermission, Danny appeared with paper bags full of roasted peanuts and candied apples, treats he had purchased for the prisoners. The sweet and salty flavors delighted them, adding to the surreal joy of the evening. Some local families watched this exchange with softening expressions, seeing perhaps for the first time that these enemy women were young, scared, and far from home, not so different from their own daughters. After the rodeo concluded, as the crowd dispersed and stars began emerging in the vast Texas sky, Bo made an impulsive decision. Rather than loading the prisoners immediately onto trucks for return to camp, he suggested they stop at a clearing near the ranch where a campfire could be built. Captain Morrison, who had accompanied them, considered briefly, then nodded approval. The evening had gone well, better than anyone expected, and extending it slightly seemed appropriate reward for everyone's good behavior. The guards gathered wood and started a fire that soon crackled warmly against the cooling night air. Everyone settled on logs and blankets in a loose circle, the formal boundaries between prisoners and guards dissolving further in the firelight's democratic glow. Someone produced a harmonica, another guard his guitar, and soft music began, nothing structured, just improvised melodies that suited the peaceful moment. Bo started talking about Wyoming, about growing up on his family's ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk. His voice carried that gentle drawl the women had grown accustomed to, and even those with limited English could follow his meaning through his tone and gestures. He described mountains that touched clouds, winters so cold that breath froze instantly, and summers when wildflowers turned entire meadows purple and gold. Red shared stories about New Mexico, about his grandmother who spoke only Spanish and made the best tamales in 3 counties. He talked about feeling caught between 2 cultures, Mexican heritage and American citizenship, and how the war had forced him to prove his loyalty repeatedly to people who should never have doubted it. Then, unexpectedly, Emiko spoke. She had not volunteered for the rodeo, but had been required to accompany the group as the eldest responsible prisoner. Emiko's voice was soft but clear in the firelight, speaking in Japanese that Red translated haltingly with help from Akiko. She talked about teaching school in Nagano, about children who brought her wildflowers and struggled with mathematics, but excelled at calligraphy. She described Mount Asama visible from her classroom window, its peak snow-covered even in summer. Her words painted a picture of a life filled with purpose and beauty, a life destroyed by decisions she had no part in making but had supported through her silence. Her confession opened floodgates. Other women began sharing their own stories, their own memories of lives left behind. Michiko described working as a radio operator, believing she was helping defend her homeland, never questioning the propaganda she transmitted. Hana talked about factory work, about making parts for aircraft that she now knew had carried bombs to innocent civilians. Each woman's story carried weight of complicity and ignorance, of participation in atrocities they had not fully understood until after defeat. Akiko spoke last, her English now strong enough to require minimal translation. She described nursing wounded soldiers, men who spoke with pride about their conquests, who described actions in China and throughout Asia that had made her uncomfortable even then. She had pushed those doubts aside, told herself that soldiers exaggerated, that her duty was to heal, not to judge. But the letters from home, the reports filtering back about what Allied forces had discovered, the full scope of Imperial Japan's crimes, all of it had forced her to confront truths she could no longer avoid. The American guards listened quietly, their faces reflecting complicated emotions. These were enemy combatants who had supported a regime responsible for horrific atrocities, for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for countless war crimes throughout Asia. Yet they were also young women who had been indoctrinated, who had believed they served a righteous cause, who now faced the terrible knowledge of what their nation had done in the name of emperor and empire. Bo finally spoke, his words careful and thoughtful. He talked about his own struggles with what America had done, about the atomic bombs that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in moments, about whether such weapons could ever be justified, even against an enemy that had committed terrible crimes. He admitted not having answers, only questions that kept him awake at night, wondering where the line between justice and revenge existed, between necessary force and excessive cruelty. Captain Morrison contributed her perspective, speaking about the concentration camps being discovered in Europe, about the systematic genocide that made even hardened soldiers weep. She talked about how every nation involved in the war had committed acts they would need to reckon with for generations, how victory did not erase moral complexity, how defeating evil required confronting the darkness within victors as well as vanquished. Danny mentioned reading about the internment of Japanese Americans, about citizens imprisoned based solely on ancestry, about property stolen and lives destroyed by fear and racism. He expressed shame that America had done this to its own people while simultaneously fighting for freedom abroad. The hypocrisy troubled him deeply. The conversation continued for hours, moving from confession to philosophy to shared grief about humanity's capacity for destruction. It was uncomfortable, painful, necessary. November brought the first real cold snap to Texas, temperatures dropping into the 30s at night and requiring the pot-bellied stoves in the barracks to run constantly. The prisoners had been issued warmer clothing, wool sweaters and heavier jackets that felt strange after years in tropical climates. Akiko found herself actually enjoying the crisp mornings, the way her breath misted in the air, the clarity of the winter sky unmarred by humidity or haze. The guards began preparing for Thanksgiving, and Danny decided this holiday presented perfect opportunity for cultural exchange. He approached Michiko and Hana, who had become his unofficial kitchen assistants, and proposed they teach him to prepare Japanese dishes while he taught them American holiday traditions. The idea delighted both women, and they enlisted others to help plan a feast that would honor both cultures. Captain Morrison approved the plan and allocated extra resources. The menu would include traditional Thanksgiving turkey with all the accompaniments, but also Japanese dishes the prisoners could prepare from available ingredients. Danny ordered rice flour, seaweed, pickled vegetables, and other items through military supply channels. The kitchen became a hub of activity, with prisoners and guards working side by side to create something unprecedented. Hana taught Danny to make onigiri, rice balls filled with various ingredients and wrapped in seaweed. She showed him the proper way to shape them, how to wet his hands with salted water, how much filling to use. Danny proved surprisingly adept, his large ranch hand fingers more delicate than they appeared. Michiko demonstrated making simple miso-like soup from available ingredients, substituting and improvising when traditional items were unavailable. In return, Danny taught them about Thanksgiving traditions. He explained the holiday's origins, the story of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing harvest feast, though he acknowledged the subsequent history was far more complicated and painful than the sanitized version he had learned as a child. He showed them how to make pumpkin pie, how to prepare stuffing, how to roast turkey until the skin turned golden and crispy. Read organized language lessons that now ran both directions. English classes continued, but guards also learned Japanese phrases, creating moments of hilarity when pronunciation went badly wrong. Bo attempted to learn words for common ranch items and animals, his Wyoming drawl making Japanese syllables sound musical and strange. The prisoners laughed at his efforts, genuine laughter free from mockery, finding his determination endearing rather than offensive. Akiko found herself teaching basic medical vocabulary, thinking it might prove useful if emergencies arose. She worked primarily with Bo, who seemed genuinely interested in learning. Their sessions became comfortable, even companionable, filled with shared smiles when he mangled pronunciation and quiet satisfaction when he finally mastered difficult terms. She noticed how patient he was, how he never rushed her explanations, how his presence had become something she anticipated rather than merely tolerated. As Thanksgiving approached, the atmosphere in camp had transformed completely from those first silent, tense days in August. The compound felt less like a prison and more like an unusual community bound by circumstance, rather than hostility, working together toward understanding, rather than simply counting days until separation. December arrived with unexpected news that shattered the comfortable routine everyone had settled into. Captain Morrison received orders that prisoner repatriation would begin in February. The women would be transported to San Francisco, then loaded onto ships bound for Japan. The war was over, their captivity ending, and they would finally return home. Morrison expected relief, perhaps even joy, when she announced this information. Instead, she saw confusion and dismay on many faces. That evening, the barracks buzzed with intense conversation. Emiko insisted this was wonderful news, the answer to months of prayers and patience. They would return to Japan, help rebuild their devastated nation, reconnect with surviving family members, and reclaim their identities as Japanese women rather than prisoners in a foreign land. Several older women agreed enthusiastically, counting days until they could leave this strange country behind. But many younger prisoners felt profoundly conflicted. Michiko sat on her bunk, arms wrapped around her knees, trying to articulate feelings she barely understood herself. She had spent 4 months in this camp, longer than she had initially believed possible. During that time, something fundamental had shifted inside her. The America she discovered here bore no resemblance to the America described in wartime propaganda. These cowboys had shown her kindness without expectation of gratitude, had treated her as fully human despite being their defeated enemy. Hana expressed even stronger feelings. At 19, she had left behind nothing in Japan except devastation and loss. Her family was scattered or dead, her neighborhood destroyed, her future prospects grim. Here, she had learned English, acquired cooking skills from Danny, made friendships with guards who saw potential in her, rather than simply war guilt. The idea of returning to rubble and starvation while leaving behind people who had become important to her felt more like punishment than liberation. Akiko remained silent during these debates, but her thoughts churned constantly. She had no family waiting in Japan. Her medical skills might be needed for rebuilding, but they were equally needed everywhere in the post-war world. More troubling was the realization that she no longer felt entirely Japanese in the way she once had. 4 months of exposure to American values, American openness, American willingness to question authority and think independently, had changed something essential in her worldview. She could not simply return to the rigid hierarchies and unquestioning obedience that had characterized her previous life. 2 weeks after the announcement, Captain Morrison received additional information that changed everything. The U.S. government was establishing a special program for certain prisoners of war, particularly those who had demonstrated exceptional conduct and rehabilitation during captivity. This program would allow prisoners to apply for permission to remain in America as immigrants, subject to extensive background checks and sponsorship requirements. The process would be difficult, competitive, and uncertain, but the possibility existed. Morrison gathered the prisoners and explained this option carefully. She emphasized that choosing to stay meant severing ties with Japan temporarily, perhaps permanently. It meant embracing a country that had been their enemy, learning a new language fluently, adapting to a radically different culture. It would not be easy. The announcement about the immigration program created immediate division among the prisoners. Emiko was horrified, viewing the option as ultimate betrayal of Japan, emperor, and everything they should value as Japanese women. She argued passionately that accepting American charity would dishonor their families, their nation, and themselves. Several older women agreed, expressing shock that anyone would even consider abandoning their homeland during its darkest hour. But younger women saw different possibilities. Michiko met privately with Captain Morrison, asking detailed questions about the application process, sponsorship requirements, and what life as a Japanese immigrant in America might realistically entail. Morrison answered honestly, not sugarcoating the challenges. Prejudice would be significant, job opportunities limited, and acceptance uncertain. Many Americans harbored deep hatred toward Japanese people after years of brutal Pacific warfare. Building a life here would require courage, resilience, and willingness to face hostility with grace. Hana decided almost immediately that she would apply to stay. She had nothing pulling her back to Japan except obligation and tradition, neither of which felt compelling compared to the genuine opportunities she sensed here. She approached Danny about sponsorship, and he agreed without hesitation, saying his family in Montana would welcome her and help her establish herself. His easy acceptance moved her to tears. Akiko struggled longest with the decision. Her medical training made her valuable in Japan, where doctors and nurses were desperately needed. Her education and family background suggested duty demanded she return and contribute to rebuilding. Yet she could not ignore how profoundly her thinking had evolved during captivity. The America she had discovered here valued individual choice, questioned authority, and allowed women opportunities unthinkable in traditional Japanese society. Late one evening, Bo found Akiko sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at stars that looked the same here as they had over Kyoto. He sat nearby without speaking, respecting her silence, offering companionship without demanding conversation. Finally, she spoke in careful English, expressing her confusion. In Japan, duty is everything. But here, I learned that choosing is also duty. Choosing what you believe, not just what you are told. I do not know which is right. Bo considered before responding. His Wyoming drawl carried unusual weight in the quiet night. Ma'am, I think maybe both can be right. Duty matters, no question. But a duty you choose, one you take on because you believe in it, rather than because someone ordered it, that kind carries more weight in the long run. He paused, then added softly, You have given me more hope than I can properly explain, seeing how you and the others learned to see past what you were taught to hate. That is not nothing. That matters. His words settled something in Akiko. She realized that choosing to stay would not be abandoning Japan, but rather honoring the best lesson this experience had taught her. That enemies could become friends, that transformation was possible, that the future did not have to repeat the past. The next morning, she submitted her application to remain in America. By the deadline, 22 women had applied to stay. 21 chose repatriation. The camp prepared for both departures and new beginnings. February 19, 1946 arrived cold and clear. The prisoners who had chosen repatriation packed their few belongings into military-issue duffel bags, their faces showing relief mixed with unexpected sadness. The women who had decided to stay helped them prepare, conversations switching between Japanese and English, tears flowing freely on both sides. These months had bonded them in ways that transcended their different choices about the future. Emiko approached Akiko before the transport trucks arrived, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. She spoke in formal Japanese, acknowledging that while she disagreed with Akiko's choice, she respected the courage it required. She pressed a small package into Akiko's hands, a set of origami papers she had carefully preserved throughout captivity. "Make beautiful things in your new home," she said quietly, then turned away before emotion could overwhelm her dignity. Captain Morrison addressed both groups one final time. She spoke about how this small camp had become an experiment in redemption and transformation, proving that even after terrible conflict, human beings could choose understanding over hatred. She thanked those returning to Japan for their exemplary conduct and urged them to carry stories of American kindness back home. To those staying, she promised continued support, but warned honestly about the difficult road ahead. The women boarding trucks for San Francisco embraced those staying behind, promises exchanged to write letters, to remember each other, to honor the unexpected friendships forged in this unlikely place. Michiko held Emiko for a long moment, thanking her for the protection and guidance she had provided, even when they disagreed about fundamental choices. Emiko's eyes glistened, but she maintained composure, boarding the truck with straight shoulders and lifted chin. As the convoy disappeared toward the horizon, the 22 remaining women stood together, suddenly feeling very small and vulnerable. They had chosen to stay in a country that had been their enemy, to build lives among people who had every reason to hate them. The magnitude of that choice hit them fully as the dust settled and silence descended. But then Bo stepped forward, hat in hand, speaking for all the guards. "You are not prisoners anymore. You are guests, neighbors, friends. We will help you get established, find work, learn what you need to know. You are not alone in this." Red nodded agreement, as did Danny and the others. Captain Morrison added that she had already contacted organizations in Dallas and Houston that assisted immigrants, that sponsorships were arranged, that the path forward existed even if it would not be easy. Over the following months, the women dispersed to various cities. Akiko found work translating for military administrative offices, her language, skills, and medical knowledge proving invaluable. Michiko began classes at a community college, studying business, with the goal of opening her own shop someday. Hana moved to Montana with Danny's family, learning ranching, and eventually marrying Danny 3 years later in a ceremony that blended both cultures. They maintained correspondence, these women who had chosen America over Japan, former enemies who became immigrants, prisoners who became citizens. Their story lived on as testament to transformation's possibility, to the power of kindness over hatred, and to the courage required to choose hope over certainty.